All right, so lesson 8, and if you see over in your top square there, the preview, it says that we're going to look at two, the head of the house and the dinner parables. Well, I wrote this as a separate lesson, and I got to the tower builder and strategist, and those were way too short, so I tacked them onto this, and you see that there in your heading, but I forgot to type that in there in your little box. I don't know if anyone even reads that. I think it's just cool that it's there. Makes it look like this is a professional lesson layout. Lifeway, just kidding. All right, so we're going to see the head of the house parable, the guest, which maybe not be a parable, we'll talk about it, and then the big dinner parable, the tower builder, and the strategist. Normally I call it the war planner, but I ran out of room, so I changed it to the strategist. These boxes are weird. Once you get out of the box, it just goes cuckoo. Anyway. All right, so we're going to look at the first one, the head of the house parable. Luke chapter 13, starting at verse 25, is where the parable begins. And so we're going to start like we always start. What section do we find these parables, or this, particularly this parable? We have our prologue. Then the second section is the pre-public life. Then we have the Galilean ministry. And then we have our big section, which is the journey to Jerusalem. Then section 5, we have entrance to Jerusalem. And then 6, in the final section, the passion of the Son. So, journey. That's correct. This parable is found in the journey section in Luke. So Luke 9:51 is where the section begins, and I put it down there. It says, when the days were approaching for his ascension, he was determined to go to Jerusalem. And so this is where we see that from this point on in Luke's gospel, he is headed towards Jerusalem. And then we start the journey section. It's the longest section, as I've been saying. And in that section, we have a ton of parables. And many of them, the majority of them, are actually unique to Luke. Meaning you won't find it in Mark and you won't find it in Matthew. And then in our chapter, verse 22, it says, and he was passing through from one city and village to another, teaching and proceeding on his way to Jerusalem. So that's just connecting that we're still on the way to Jerusalem there in verse 22. And so what is the lead in? So I said it started in 25 with a parable, but
Okay, I'm confused. We're not 9?
13.
We're in 13 now.
oh, sorry. We are chapter 13. And the parable starts in 25, but I started us back up in 22 to see that we're still on the way to Jerusalem. Jesus was determined to go there. He's still on the way there. And then we're always looking for what might give us a hint to what this parable will be about. And that's usually found in the lead-in or the context or story right before. So what is our lead-in?
People being saved.
Yeah. In verse 23, a man's question concerning those being saved. It says, and someone said to him, Lord, are there just a few who are being saved? So the question is about salvation, and for the Jew, salvation would have been entering the kingdom, living in the kingdom. They didn't have really a concept of heaven as that's where we're going to go when we die. It was when you die, you go to Sheol in the ground, and then there's the resurrection to the kingdom. And so the kingdom was salvation for the Jew. And so he's asking, when he says, are there only a few being saved? He's asking, are there only a few who are entering the kingdom? And he said to them, verse 24, strive to enter through the narrow door. For many, I tell you, will seek to enter and will not be able. So Jesus, his answer is strive through the narrow door. And his explanation is many will seek to enter and not be able. So what do we think this parable is going to be about?
Those They can't enter.
Yeah, those unable to enter the kingdom. He says, many will seek to enter and not be able. And so then he goes into the parable. Do we get that blank? Try not to leave anyone behind who's filling in. All right, here's the parable. Once the head of the house gets up and shuts the door, and you begin to stand outside and knock on the door, saying, Lord, open up to us, then he will answer and say to you, I do not know where you're from. Then you will begin to say, we ate and drank with you in your presence, and you taught in our streets. And he'll say, I tell you, I don't know where you're from. Depart from me, all you evildoers. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth when you see Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and all the prophets in the kingdom of God, but you yourselves being thrown out. All right. So the first question, what does the head of the house represent? Or who do you think he represents?
Right.
God? Yeah. I think that, or that's what I put in the answer, but it could also be just a character in the story that's just advancing the story, right? You need someone there to shut the door, right? I think it's God, and I think there's a link later we'll see in another parable. But yeah, I think it's God. So what do those who have been shut out say?
Well, I have a quick question.
Okay.
Okay, it says they have been shut out. In other words, the door is shut and they are not in. So how can they be thrown out?
We're going to get to that. I'm glad you asked that. Yeah, it's in the notes. I'm glad you asked that. That means you're thinking like I thought you would be thinking. I'm anticipating. And sometimes I anticipate completely wrong. So, thanks for the confirmation. Yes, good question. And I will point back to you to give you credit when we get there. They're shut out, and they say, open up to us. And the head of the house responds, I do not know where you are from. Then they respond back, we ate and drank where? In your presence. And you taught us where? In our streets. And then the head of the house responds, I do not know where you are from. So do you see that a lot of this is about proximity, using a lot of words, where, from, and they're saying we were here, we were in your presence. So there's a theme here of proximity. And he says, depart from me, all you evildoers, which is Psalm, a quotation there, so probably all caps in your Bibles, Psalm 6:8. And in the context of Psalm 6:8, the enemies are the enemies of the king of Israel. And the king in the psalm is King David. Now you got the greater son of David here, Jesus, and he's saying, depart from me, if this is Jesus in the parable. He's saying, depart from me, evildoer. So in the context of Jesus' audience, who do you think the evildoers are in the parable? I put, and I marked out, but not on yours, I put Pharisees / Jews, but I'm taking that back. I think it's just Jews in general, because you see down at the bottom, the Pharisees approach in verse 31. So I think I got ahead of myself there, so correcting myself. I think it's probably the Jews are his audience that he's talking to, and we're going to see why from the context. And back to your question. If they're shut out, how can they be thrown out? And that's a question I asked. Who is thrown out of the kingdom? Because Jesus says, this isn't a part of the parable, this is the summary of what he's teaching. And that, he says, depart from you, evildoers. That's what the head of the house says to the people knocking who are shut out. And then Jesus explains, in that place where they're departed to, there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth when you see Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and all the prophets in the kingdom of God, but you yourselves being thrown out. So who's thrown out? I think the hint is in the next verse. But I think those expected to be in first are the ones who are thrown out, which are the Jews who reject Jesus. And then in verse 29 it says, and they will come from the east and from the west and from the north and south and will recline at the table in the kingdom of God. So who are the they dining in the kingdom of God? Gentiles. And remember, Luke is written to a Gentile audience. And we have Matthew, who there's this motif of, you Jews, because you're descendants of Abraham, you think you're automatically in because of your descent and nationality. But you might actually not be in because you've rejected Jesus. And so that's kind of the warning to the Jewish audience. Are you going to follow the Pharisees or are you going to follow Jesus? Here the motif is the flip. It's you think you're out automatically because of your nationality, because you're not a Jew. And it's a Jewish kingdom, right? It's a Jewish Messiah, Jewish king, Jewish kingdom. This is the Jewish God, Yahweh. And they think they're automatically out because they're not Jewish. But Luke is saying, hang on a second, you might actually be in. It all depends on what you do with Jesus. And so you see this theme throughout Luke that the unexpected, the last, are the Gentiles, and they're the ones being saved. So I think that they are the Gentiles. And then you have the in stress. So remember, the in stress of a parable is that last part of the parable that you want the audience to be left with, like, oh, shoot, like, whoa. And the in stress here is, where are they from? They're from east and from west and north and south. So I just put in the blanks there and highlighted for some of you the word from, because here we have the proximity again. The people that were shut out, they were near the head, right? You were in our streets. You taught us. We were in your presence. And he's like, I don't know where you're from. But then these people who are from far away are actually the ones in. So you see the juxtaposition, the contrast there, that the people who are wanting to be in are the ones who are near the head of the house. And he's saying, I don't know where you're from. But then the ones who are actually going to come and recline at the table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who are the Jewish forefathers, the patriarchs, are actually Gentiles. And they're from far away. And so I think this Abrahamic covenant, alluding to it, Genesis 28:14 talks about Abraham's descendants being like the dust, like sand, like dust, and that they'll be from the east and the west, and the north and the south, and that all families will be blessed through Abraham. So even going back to Genesis 12, the Abrahamic covenant, there's always this idea that Gentiles would be included into God's family. That all the families of the earth would be blessed through Abraham, Genesis 12:3. And the whole, back to the thrown out of the kingdom, we looked at it a little bit in Matthew and kind of confused about it. And we saw the two different views there in Matthew 22. There's some other places. Matthew uses the phrase thrown out a lot. I think Luke only uses it here. I think that it's just what's called a colloquialism. It's just a saying that means something. It's not a literal phrase. So they're not thrown out. If it was a literal phrase, then it's confusing. How are they thrown out if they're not in? But I think to be thrown out is a colloquialism that just means that you're rejected from entering. You're not ever going to be in, so you're out. Kind of saying. Does that make
But
sense?
it almost makes it sound like, yeah, you're out, but you can still see that, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the patriarchs.
Yeah, you'll be able, yeah.
It's like, oh, you can see it, but you can't come in.
And in 2 weeks, we're going to see Lazarus. Now, I think the kingdom is different than Hades in Abraham's bosom, but in that you see the rich man looking and seeing Abraham and Lazarus with him. He's able to talk to him even though there's this great chasm. And so he can see those on paradise side or Abraham's bosom from torment side. I don't know how it is, but this would have been kind of the slap in the face to the Jew who's rejecting Jesus. Like, we're in the kingdom, you're not our king, and Jesus saying, well, you're going to be thrown out, and the Gentiles will be the ones who will recline with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom.
So, what we were discussing earlier today, would that have to do with like when you're in heaven and like the people, like the rewards stuff, like pop up?
Oh, no.
No, okay.
No. You're talking. Yeah, that was talking about like what's going on right now with loved ones who are in heaven versus this is in the kingdom to come. When the kingdom, Jesus comes back in the kingdom, he brings the kingdom, sets it up for 1,000 years. That's what this is about, is the earthly kingdom, not so much about what's going on in heaven right now.
See, I kind of got lost with this. It's about salvation, but it's not about being born again. It is, see, I'm hearing it's more about being a Jew or a Gentile, where I was expecting to hear about faith and salvation.
Yeah. So, because it is about salvation, who's going to be saved? Meaning who's going to be in the kingdom. And so Jesus is taking an opportunity to use this real life question to talk about who is going to be in the kingdom. And so it is about faith. And we wish Jesus would talk more like Paul, just be straightforward. But Jesus is always using things around us, illustrations, and in this case a parable, to teach about who is unable to be in the kingdom. And so the people who are rejecting Jesus, not believing that he's the Messiah, that's the context surrounding this, right? Jesus has been rejected by the nation. He's on his way to Jerusalem to be completely rejected, handed over, betrayed, crucified. And so he's speaking more into the context, if that makes sense. So the parable isn't about how to be saved. It's about who's unable to enter. And the ones who are unable to enter are the ones who have rejected him. And the point here is he's talking to the Jews. And again, he's saying to the Jewish audience, just because you're a Jew doesn't mean you're in. It's what do you do with Jesus? And to wake them up, to slap them in the face, he's warning them that you could be thrown out because it's not about your nationality. And the Gentiles will come in. And I think that's why he's using Abrahamic covenant language, because the Jew would know, oh yeah, I forgot way back in Genesis 12 that God promised through Abraham that all the families of the earth would be blessed, not just Jews, but Jews and Gentiles. And so because he's writing to a Gentile, Luke is writing to a Gentile audience, he's using this specific story from Jesus to talk straight to a Gentile audience to say, you can be in too. It just depends on what you do with Jesus. Obviously, put your faith in him. Like, don't assume just because you're not Jewish that you're thrown out. Anybody who rejects Jesus is going to be the one out. And the ones in at the table are the ones who believe in Jesus.
What was Luke's ethnicity? Was he a Jew?
He was Greek.
Okay.
Um,
I've always heard Luke the physician,
Yeah.
and I just assumed one of the disciples. Well,
No, he was a disciple of Paul. He was a physician. He was a Greek. His gospel, like, not only does he have stories that are unique to him, his vocab is very unique to him. It's very medical in places that he changes from Matthew. That's not real medical. So, and there's some who, not a lot, but a really smart guy out of Southwestern, he's got a whole book. He thinks Luke actually wrote Hebrews, which
because
is,
we don't know who wrote it.
we don't know who wrote Hebrews, but it's weird because we always think that Hebrews was written by a Jew because it knows so much about the law. But he has a book that big for you where he argues that Hebrews was probably written by Luke. I think you're nodding like you know what I'm talking about, so he knows. I'm not making it up. All right, so then at verse 31, just at that time, look who shows up. Some Pharisees approach saying, go away, leave here. So there's more proximity. So Jesus utilizes proximity in his parable to set up a contrast between Jews and Gentiles. Who's in, who's out. And he finishes by saying, some are last who will be first, and some are first who will be last. Talking about in the kingdom. The Gentiles would have been the last people you expected in the kingdom because they were not Jewish, right? Who would have been the very first people you expect to be in a Jewish kingdom with the Jewish Messiah? The Jews. But here Jesus is denouncing the Jews, and he's saying it's open to anyone.
Why did the Pharisees come up to him and say, "Go away, leave here"?
I think he's continuing that proximity theme here. So now remember who's in the story, who's in the parable that's closest to Jesus. The people that are shut out. Right? And who's the people who are far away? The people who are coming in. So the Gentiles are far out. The people close in the parable are the ones who are shut out. Now who's close? Now the parable's over. Now we start the story, the narrative again. Who's close to Jesus? The Pharisees. And they're telling him to go away. You can't tell someone to go away unless you're close to them. They're the ones who have the proximity. He's the Jew. He's in the midst of Israel. He's there with them. He's teaching in their streets and all this stuff. And he's saying, I don't know where you're from. I don't know you.
In my version of the Bible, it says, "Get away from here because Herod wants to kill you."
Yeah. And then he says, go tell that fox, which I think is funny. I start calling people foxes. Go tell that fox.
Why do they care if Herod wants to kill him?
I don't know. I think, in my mind, I think they're just trying to get rid of him. Hey, if someone wants to kill you, you better go away from here. I don't think I don't know if Herod really wanted to kill him or not. I don't know. I think it's just going back into the proximity. It's just connecting them into who's he talking about in the parable. They're the ones close to Jesus, and so therefore the Pharisees will be the ones who are shut out. And obviously we know the Pharisees have rejected Jesus. And then he says, go tell that fox, behold, I cast out demons and perform cures today and tomorrow, and on the third day I reach my goal. Nevertheless, I must journey on today and tomorrow and the next day, for it cannot be that a prophet would perish outside of Jerusalem. So the parable is about those who are unable to enter the kingdom of God. Those who reject Jesus, the narrow gate, are the ones. So it kind of does go back to what you're saying about faith. He just didn't put it in terms of faith. He just said, enter through the narrow gate. And Jesus is the narrow gate. So Jesus, in these verses I just read, 32 and 33, he's speaking of his death because that's why he's on his way to Jerusalem. And then it says, 34, O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who's sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together, just as the hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you would not have it. So I put here just a little Bible study lesson. Bible study method lesson. How does a city kill? He said, "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets." How does a city kill? If we're being literal, our literal interpretation.
City is the people.
Yeah, see, it's easy. But this is what's called a metonymy. So the literary device is a metonymy. Oh, spell it. I just want us to be really smart and break these words out and impress people. Oh, also metonymy. If I can remember how to spell it, that's how stupid I am. So that is what's called the literary device. And then in the device, we have Jerusalem. And Jerusalem is functioning as the leaders, the people. It's the leaders of Israel who are killing and stoning the prophets. And so Jerusalem is functioning as a metonym. Like we would say a synonym or an antonym. So a metonym. So that's just something else we can add to our tool belt and our Bible study methods when we're studying on our own. We know. And we this is all the time. You watch the news, you're like, the White House just said today. It's like, the White House is talking now? Like, what's happening? No. The White House is functioning as a metonym for the president, right?
Okay.
That one's different and tough. Do we have any questions? All right, this goes straight into the guest. In the parable, maybe the parable. We'll talk about it. It starts in verse 7. But in verse 1, of chapter 14, says, "It happened that when Jesus went to the house of one of the leaders of the Pharisees on the Sabbath to eat bread, they were watching him closely." So where's Jesus now? He's the house of one of the leaders of the Pharisees to eat bread. Don't miss that part. He's there to eat bread. And what day is it? It's the Sabbath. So we know something's about to happen. It's always on the Sabbath. All right, so there in front of him was a man suffering from dropsy. And Jesus answered and spoke to the lawyers and the Pharisees, saying, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not?" Remember, they've been watching him because to heal on the Sabbath, they're like, "Oh, that's work. You're guilty of breaking the Sabbath. We can kill you." So they're watching to see if he commits a Sabbath break. But they kept silent. And he took hold of him and healed him and sent him away. And he said to them, "Which one of you will have a son or an ox fall into a well and not immediately pull him out on a Sabbath day?" So this is an example of harmony. This is not a parable, but this is going to give us a little bit of context for our next parable. This is harmony. Can anyone find the harmony in this story? So harmony, we've talked about harmony as like you had the woman who was hemorrhaging for 12 years, and also in the story was a girl who was 12 years old, right? There's harmony of 12.
Did we have like sevens? Were there like sevens or something?
In another story, yeah, sometimes there's, well, like the 12, sometimes there's numbers that are reoccurring that harmonizes two different parts of a narrative. So do we know what dropsy is? That would be helpful probably.
I think it's a neurodegenerative disease.
I'm not sure entirely, but it's like,
Their feet?
it's the accumulating of water under your skin.
Oh.
So I don't know.
I'm not gonna look that up.
Don't Google image that. Do not Google image that. So basically, this guy who's suffering is drowning in his own flesh, and they're like, "You can't heal him because that's work on the Sabbath." And so Jesus heals the guy.
The
Obviously,
Bible says edema.
okay. What's edema?
Same thing.
Okay.
Swelling
It's like,
of the water.
is edema?
Yeah, it's like accumulation of water.
Yeah. For some reason, I was thinking edema was a skin disease.
No, it's like
That-
eczema.
Oh, that's what I have. Okay. So he heals this guy who's basically drowning in his own skin, literally, actually. And then he looks to them and he says, "Who has a son or an ox do what?" Fall in a well. So if you fall in a well, you're drowning, right? Would you not go save your son or an ox who's drowning? Or would you say, "Oh, it's the Sabbath. You better tread good, like keep that head up. We'll be back tomorrow."
Oh, actually, that would be work. I don't think they would say that.
Yeah. Depends on how far they have to travel to the well. But yeah, so just classic Jesus using a harmony to put the Pharisees in their place to understand the hypocrisy of their own traditions. That they would say, "Well, you can't heal this guy because it's the Sabbath. He's clearly suffering." But of course, every single one of them, if their son or ox fell into a well and was drowning, they would pull him out immediately on the Sabbath and not count that as work. So this story adds to build the tension between Jesus and the Pharisees. So I'll put that there. This interaction heightens the tension between Jesus and the Pharisees and is our lead-in for the dinner parable. Because what's Jesus doing there? He's eating bread. So verse 7, he began speaking a parable to the invited guests when he noticed how they had been picking out seats at the places of honor at the table. So the question is, why does Jesus give this parable? He notices that the guests are jockeying for position. So the seats of honor would have been the ones closest to the host. So everyone's trying to get close to the head of the table, basically. And Jesus is seeing this, so he's like, parable time. And I don't know if this is a parable, and then starting in verse 16 is another parable. That's how we're going to do it tonight. I'm kind of inclined to think that when he says he began speaking in a parable, I think the parable actually is starting in 16. But if this is a parable, as we'll see in a minute, it'll be a new part of our thing that I draw. And we'll get to it in a second. So we'll just head into this one. And he says, when you are invited by someone to a wedding feast, do not take the place of honor, for someone more distinguished than you may have been invited by him. And he who invited you both will come to you and say to you, give your place to this man. And then in disgrace you proceed to occupy the last place. But when you are invited, go and recline at the last place, so that when the one who has invited you comes, he may say to you, friend, move up higher. Then you will have honor in the sight of all who are at the table with you. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. So again, Jesus uses a real life situation as an opportunity to teach in parables. In the places of honor, like I said, were seats closest to the host. And so Jesus gives this parable to the guests. He's speaking to the guests who are fighting for positions of honor, who are self-exalting. And what do you think the wedding feast represents in this parable? If you have my notes, you know.
Nothing. The new one that's added to the list.
Yeah. It's nothing. There's nothing that tells us that this is anything. He's actually talking to them. And so you see that there's this far right spot now called realistic. And if this is a parable, and there's one coming up, not tonight, that we'll see, that's a realistic one. A realistic is just basically, he's just using a story to teach them as, like, not even a story. He's just using an example, basically. So, like, there's no real story here. He just says, when you're invited. That's not like, there was a guy who had a feast, and some were invited. He's just speaking realistically to them when you are invited. We don't see this very often. I think this one, if this is a parable, it's realistic, or maybe he's just teaching to them to set up for the parable starting in verse 16. I don't know. I wrote it this way, and I didn't want to go back and rewrite it, so I'm teaching it both ways. So then we have the point here of his teaching is everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. And the lesson is that these guests are in danger of being demoted because of their self-exaltation. Because their attitude is self-promotion, and that's not the way of Jesus. And he's saying this is what happens when we're self-promoting, self-exalting, is we oftentimes get embarrassed. And so I had learned this parable a long time ago, and when I was in seminary, I was a intern in the equipping department at our church in Dallas. It's a big church, and so I was in a whole department of other people. And then our pastor, he would invite, like, the different groups or heads, like the head of the equipping, the head of the outreach, and they would all come in and help him brainstorm and give feedback to his sermon prep. And that day, because we had been studying Romans in our small group with our equipping pastor, we all got the invite to go to the pastor's office and help him with his sermon. So there's a bunch of us walking into his office, and I noticed right away that there's a chair and a couch, and there's way more of us than there are seats. And I was like, I'm not taking anyone's spot. So I just plopped down on the ground and leaned up against the side of the couch. And everyone kind of comes in and is sitting down, and Neil, the senior pastor, stops and looks at me like I'm an idiot. He's like, what are you doing? Get off the ground. We'll go get a chair for you. But that is, I would prefer to be looked at like an idiot far more than come in and sit in his spot and he'd be like, that's fine. I'll go over here, you know? He wouldn't have been like that. But you know what I mean. It's always just good to practice how can I be humble and behave in such a way that I can only go up, right? I can only be advanced through humility and not demoted through pride and arrogance. Whole nother story about how I got serious about my faith in high school. That was the opposite story. That was a self-exaltation story, and the Lord brought me low. But we don't have time for that. Well, maybe we do. But, okay. So then in verse 12, Jesus, it says that he also went on to say to the one who had invited him. So Jesus the question is, who does Jesus turn to address next? And it's the one who invited him. So he has just talked to the guests at this dinner, and now he's talking to the host, or the one who has invited. So now he's got a little lesson for this guy. And he says to the one who had invited him, when you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or rich neighbors. Otherwise, they may also invite you in return, and that will be your repayment. But when you give a reception, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind. Put it there for you in the blanks. The poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind. And you will be blessed, since they do not have the means to repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. So the lesson for the host is he has the power to exalt the humble. So what this host has done is he's invited all the self-exalting ones, right? And what Jesus is saying, as the host, you have the power to invite the lowly and exalt them through your invitation to be at the dinner. And what does that tell us about Jesus? He's the one who exalts, and he's the one who humbles. And it says, verse 15, when one of those who were reclining at the table with him heard this, he said to him, blessed is everyone who will eat bread in the kingdom. And then that gives Jesus the opportunity to tell the parable in verse 16. So this is where for sure the parable begins. So there's two ways you can take what we've done so far. That there's separate parables, the guests, or I call it the guests, or the dinner, and then you have the big dinner, which is what we're about to do. Or you could take it as Jesus is speaking into a parable, but before we get to the parable, we get more of the lead in, the context. Why is he giving this parable about a big dinner? It's because he's at a dinner with self-exalting people. So verse 16, but he said to him, a man was giving a big dinner, and he invited many. So do we see the difference versus a man's giving a big dinner versus, hey, when you're invited to a dinner? That's why that's more realistic, and this is going to be somewhere else in the embodiment design area. So a man was giving a big dinner, and he invited many. And at the dinner hour he sent his slave to say to those who had been invited, come, for everything is ready now. But they all alike began to make excuses. The first one said to him, I have bought a piece of land, and I need to go out and look at it. Please consider me excused. And another one said, I have bought 5 yoke of oxen, and I'm going to try them out. Please excuse me, or please consider me excused. And another said, I have a married wife, and for that reason I cannot come. And so you see a pattern of 3. So that's often in parables, there's patterns of 3. So there's our pattern of 3 that cannot come, or that declined the invitation, you could say. And the slave came back and reported to his master. Then the head of the household became angry and said to his slave, go out at once to the streets and the lanes of the city and bring in who? The poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame. So we have a lexical link back to where? To what he just talked to the host about. When you throw a dinner, who do you invite? Not your buddies. Verse 22, and the slave said, Master, what you commanded has been done. There is still room. And the master said to the slave, go out into the highways and along the hedges and compel them to come so that my house may be filled. For I tell you, none of those men who were invited shall taste my dinner. So we have 3 groups not just a pattern of three within the first group, but a pattern of three groups. The first group all rejected the invitation, right? For whatever reason, they rejected it. I think this group represents the self-exalting Jews. These are the ones that are rejecting Jesus in the context so far of Luke. The second group, look where they're found. They're found in the streets and the lanes of the city. So they're in town. I think these, because of their situation, the poor, being poor, crippled, blind, and lame, these are the lowly. These are the humble Jews, right? So these are the ones that accept the invitation. And then where does the third group come from?
Highway.
They come from the highways and the hedges. So the hedges probably are talking about the country roads that would line around the hedges. So this is on the outside. So they're the first group, they rejected the invitation. The second group, they're in town. They're the poor, the blind, the crippled, they're the lowly. And then there's this third group that are out-of-towners. They're on the outside. You got to go down the highway to get to these people. So I take this as Gentiles because they're far away. And this part where he says, go to the highways and along the hedges, this would have been the in stress, I think. This would have been like for a Jew reading or hearing this parable, they would have been like, what? Or for a Gentile reading this, they would have been like, oh, good, we're invited, you know? So that's the part that's like, oh, big news. So the third group invited are from far away. And then at the end, what does Jesus say about the parable? None of those who were what? Invited shall taste my dinner. Who were the ones invited that will not taste the dinner in the parable?
Jews.
Well, in the parable. The ones who rejected the invitation. Because it says they were invited, they all rejected it for whatever reason, and so they will not do what? Eat. Now going back up to what started this in verse 15, the Pharisees said, blessed is everyone who will eat bread in the kingdom of God. And Jesus is saying, hey guy, you don't accept the invitation, you're not going to eat at my table. Jesus called it my table. If you don't believe that the kingdom is Jesus's and that the table in the kingdom is his table, then you won't be there. And the Pharisees did not believe that about Jesus. Something that is good, and I don't know if I said it in my video lesson or not. Going back to chapter 7, verse 30. This is good for us to know, especially as we're going through it on Luke on Sunday. Verse 30 says in chapter 7, but the Pharisees and the lawyers rejected God's purposes for them, not having been baptized by John. And so what does that mean to reject John's baptism? It's to reject John's message about the kingdom and Jesus as the coming king. Because remember, he was making way for Jesus. He's preparing the way. They rejected his message or testimony concerning Jesus. And so by rejecting his testimony about Jesus, they have rejected Jesus. They have rejected God's purposes for them. That word purpose in Greek is the strongest word you can use for will or desire. So we know, going all the way back to chapter 7, that the Pharisees and the lawyers, the leaders of Israel, have rejected God's purposes by rejecting Jesus. So that's how I keep saying I know who the rejectors are here. I know who the ones that aren't accepting the invitation, because Jesus already knows who's rejected him. And we know from Luke, going back to chapter 7, that it's the lawyers and the Pharisees of Israel who have rejected Jesus. They've rejected the invitation. So here they are eating with Jesus. I put there, the Pharisees are eating with the king, and because of their rejection of him, they will not eat with him in his kingdom. They don't even know that this is as good as it's going to get for them. Blessed is everyone who eats bread in the kingdom, and this is as close as they'll get, and they have no clue that this is it. The parable is about who is unworthy to enter the kingdom. So our first parable, the head of the house, is about who is unable to enter the kingdom. And then we have chapter 14. This is all about who is unworthy. And those who are unworthy are the self-exalting ones. And because I wrote this originally as one lesson, I put, how should we live? As disciples of Jesus, we should continue to live in the same manner in which we were saved, as humble men and women. The principle of exaltation and humility is also found in the Christian life. So it is found in how a person is saved, right? You're arrogant, self-exalting, you don't need Jesus, then why would you ever trust in him? But if you're humble and loyal like the blind, the crippled, and the lame, and you need a Savior, then you're more likely to trust in Jesus. But that's salvation, and it continues. The principle continues in the Christian life. If we live arrogantly like we don't need Jesus, he's going to humble us. High school story I alluded to. But if we're living humbly, then what is the principle? God will exalt us. However, whatever that looks like for God, that's the principle. And then I just put from this chapter, verse 11, as a memory verse. Any questions? I thought it was supposed to get colder in here. It's like,
I know, I brought a blanket, now it's 74 degrees.
whew, I put on I had it like a t-shirt on, and I was like, oh, I even asked her, it gets cold in there, doesn't it? She's like, yeah. I was like, oh, I'll put it on.
Tonight, I see it, it's 74, usually it's 71.
Thank you.
Glad I put extra deodorant on. More than you wanted to know. All right, if there's no questions, we'll go into these last two parables. These are actually pretty short. And so this will be, we're just following the passage here. Now we're going to go right from verse 24 into verse 25. And we know, like we've already said, this parable is also on the journey section because we haven't moved very far. So it's still in the journey section. He's still moving, and that's important because the next question is, where is Jesus going? Going to Jerusalem to die on a cross. This is where he's going. He is determined to go. It said when the time of his ascension has come. You can't have an ascension unless you have a burial and a resurrection. Then you have his ascension. So the plan is for him to go die on the cross, pay for sins, be buried, 3 days later, rise again, and then ascend to the right hand of the Father. That is where he's going in the story. Where's the crowd going? Let me get there. Verse 25. Large crowds were going along with him. So they're going with Jesus. And he turned and said to them, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not carry his own cross and come after me, cannot be my disciple. So this is kind of our lead into the parables. So the crowd is going along with Jesus. Jesus is going to Jerusalem to die, and they're like, we're coming. They don't.
They may be going anyway.
Yeah, but they're following him the way it's written, because what's he doing? He turns and he says to them, if you want to come after me. But you're for sure right, because he's going up for Passover.
Right.
And depending on where he is exactly, I don't think he's to the ascent yet. We talked about that road when we talked about the Good Samaritan. That was like 17 miles up to Jerusalem. It's the elevation. It increases like 3,300 feet. Super dangerous. So they traveled in groups because it was safer that way. I don't think he's there yet. I don't think that's where we're at, because it says he's going from village to village in that last section we looked at. So for sure there would have been crowds traveling together, but because Jesus stops the crowd, and I'm going to connect this too to the parable, what they're doing. So the crowd, they don't know where they're going. Obviously they know they're going to Jerusalem, but they don't know Jesus is going to die. But they're wanting to go after him or go along with him. And so then we have the love versus hate, right? Who here wants to teach me this one?
I'm listening.
If anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father, mother, wife, children, brothers, sisters, yes, even his own life, cannot be my disciple. Who here is going to be a good disciple? Why is this hard?
Because Jesus says hate
Yes, but who are we hating?
our family.
People we love.
Yes, these are like, out of all the people in the world that he says we need to hate, who is he saying? The people we love the most, right? Okay, so do you think Jesus wants us to hate, literally hate our family, our mothers and fathers? No, because obviously we're to honor our mothers and fathers, right? So what's going on is this is figurative language to emphasize scale of love. Does that make sense? These are the people that in the world you love the most. But figuratively, you need to hate them in comparison to your love for Jesus. So what that looks like is you love Jesus so much that your relationship could be misunderstood. Like, you know, I've read stories of like Muslims who will convert to Christianity knowing it will put them out of their family or possibly be killed by their parents in an honor killing. That is loving Jesus more than their mother and father. Now that's extreme for us. That's not, but that is an example of a real world type of deal of actually doing that. I think what Jesus is talking about is the figurative scale. He's saying that these are the people you love the most, but your love for him should make it look like you hate them, figuratively, right? Not literally. Is this making any sense? It's more abstract thinking than it is our literal thinking that we normally do when we read in the Bible. So I think he's just being figurative to make a point of this. Where's your devotion? You love Jesus so much that your love for family may be misunderstood in comparison. I know I have heard of people who become missionaries against their mother and father's will because it's dangerous. And so it looks like they're being disobedient to their parents, but they feel this calling on their life is so strong, and their love and devotion and commitment to Jesus and doing what he wants them to do in comparison to what their parents want, it looks like their relationship with their family could be misunderstood. So I think the point is that a disciple should strive daily to make Jesus the preeminent one over his or her life. That's all I think this means. If Jesus is preeminent, then everything kind of falls into place relationship-wise. But I say strive daily because you could do it one day and flop the next day. Speaking from experience.
Verse 28 answered a lot of that.
Yeah, that's our parable. And so, Roman prisoners carried their own crosses to execution. We know that from Jesus, right? Jesus is emphasizing their own death is a real possibility in the next verse when he says, whoever does not carry his own cross and come after me cannot be a disciple. So you see there it says, if anyone comes to me and come after me, it's both same in the Greek. Come after, I think, has a double meaning. It has one to mean to follow, right? You want to come after me, that means you want to be a follower of me. But it also can mean come next. And I think we see Mark pick up on this a lot in like chapter 8 of his gospel and 9. So come after means to follow, to be a disciple, but it also means to come. What does it mean to be a disciple? It means you're next. So I put for number 2, come next. To come after means to come next. If Jesus is going to the cross, he's saying, if you want to be my disciple, you want to come after me, then you better be ready to come next after me, because I'm going to the cross. and you got to carry your own cross, which means there's a real possibility that you could die too if you're serious about being my disciple. And this leads us into our parable. What did I put there? The first crowd has this part, but does not understand fully what following Jesus could entail. And I think that's why he stops and turns and tells them this. And I'll kind of flesh that out here. To be committed, so this is just a little discipleship stuff that we know. To be committed to go as far as to die for Jesus, our love for him must be disproportionately greater than other relationships. And I think that's the hate your mother and father part. We are to love them, no doubt. But when we love Jesus, we're actually loving them. And so our love for Jesus should be disproportionately greater than our love for our spouses and our love for our kids and whoever else. It even says even our own lives. We know eternal life is a free gift. Ephesians 2:8-9, for by grace you've been saved, not of yourselves. It's the gift of God, not as a result of works, that no one may boast. Romans 6:28, the free gift of God is eternal life in Christ Jesus our Lord. And it's on the basis of faith alone. John 3:16, whoever believes in him. Romans 4:5, but to him who does not work but believes in him, his faith is credited as righteousness. But to be a worthy disciple, it will cost you your life. And I qualify disciple as worthy because what you have here are people following Jesus. And so in a sense, they're wanting to be disciples, but they don't fully understand what Jesus is calling them to be as disciples. And that's why he's going to give them these parables.
So is that a literal statement?
Which one?
To be a worthy disciple, it will cost you your life.
What do you mean? Is it in the Bible?
No, I understand that it's in the Bible. Is that statement, do you consider that a figurative statement again, or a literal statement?
Both.
Both.
I think figurative, it means it's going to cost you your selfishness, remember talking about your desire and love for him should be disproportionately greater than from even your own life. So you're dying to yourself. So it'll cost you your life in that figurative sense, that you no longer live for your, like Paul says in Galatians 2:20, for it's no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. The life which I now live, I live in the flesh. The Son of God who loved me and gave himself up for me. So it's Christ's life in us, and he no longer lives. And so that's kind of the model as a disciple is I'm no longer living, but Christ is living in me. So I'm not doing the selfish things, the sinful things that everybody else might be doing around me, because I've been called to live and follow Jesus and do what he's asked me to do. But then I think there is a literal sense that there are many places around the world, thankfully not here, where people do lose their lives for being a disciple of Jesus. I mean, yeah. I was going to tell stories. Okay. Does that help?
Yes.
Okay. I think it's both figurative and literal. Because I don't think, yeah. And geographically, probably won't cost you your physical life here in America. Could, certain parts of the country, maybe, but that's rare compared to like Iran, where you got the people get picked up off the street all the time because they get found out that they're part of the underground church. Okay. So we don't have that fear just disappearing off the street for being a Christian or a disciple, but that is a literal example of costing your life.
Quick question. So the group that's following Jesus, just if you know, like, was it probably mainly Jews? Was it a mixture of Jews and Gentiles?
I think it was just Jews.
Just Jews.
It would have been weird for Gentiles to be in the Jewish part of the country.
Yeah. Because just from our point of view, like, people didn't like to talk about crucifixion because it was like it was like for the worst people, right? Like the lowest, like it was very,
Yeah.
shameful.
So,
It
yeah.
would have been more of a shock factor to them then, because I feel like Romans would have been like, oh yeah, crucifixion, that's horrible.
It would have been a shock factor to the people reading this, the Gentiles. The Jews,
Would have been a shock after he died.
maybe so. So what he's talking about is in the Greco-Roman world, especially the Roman world, because it was a Roman form of execution, and it was for the worst. And so they didn't even say the word cross. If you said the word cross, it was like, oh gosh, you just like moved away from that person. You don't say that word. And so, yeah, so when like Paul, like in Philippians, we won't go there, but there's places where I think he's deliberately saying cross to shock the readers, to be like, oh my gosh, he just said that. But we don't think about that because the cross is a good thing to us. But in that culture, the cross was like super
Taboo.
Yeah, like you don't mention it.
I imagine too that like the people following Jesus when he says cross, they could have been confused too, because wasn't
'Cause he had-
like
he
the
was gonna die.
crucifixion a death for Roman citizens and they're Jews?
No, it was
Anybody?
yeah. Roman citizens
Roman citizens couldn't be.
couldn't be. That's why
crucified. I
Paul
got
was
it. I got it
beheaded.
flipped. That's
Yeah.
right.
Yeah, Paul, because he was a citizen, wasn't crucified.
Right, that's right.
They're like, we'll be humane. We'll just chop your head off.
Might be. I got it flipped.
But would it mattered as much to the Jews? Would they have been as like, oh, don't say that compared to?
Not compared to the Romans or Greeks, for sure. No, because that wasn't a part of their culture. It's kind of imported because their method of execution was stoning. So they would have known what it meant, but I don't think it would have been as like, did Jesus just say that? Now, to Luke's readers, I think they would have been like, do we want to follow Jesus? Because this is horrible. And I think that's why we have these two parables. So I'll get into it. The first one is the tower builder. Verse 20, what was it? 28?
Yeah.
It says, for which one of you, when he wants to build a tower, does not first sit down and calculate the cost to see if he has enough to complete it? Or otherwise, when he has laid a foundation and is not able to finish it, all who observe it begin to ridicule him, saying, this man began to build and was not able to finish. So, what must the builder do first? What is Jesus saying the builder should do? Sit down. What's the crowd doing? Walking. Sit down and calculate the cost. What is he calculating? Calculate the cost. The builder must ask if he has what it takes to finish.
I always think about that house that we drive past on the way to Texas, that huge.
Which one?
That big house, you know.
Oh,
for you.
like above, just north of Denton?
Yeah,
That for my whole life is just,
been not finished.
someone bought it.
Oh, really?
Mm-hmm. Someone had bought the land and has been using it for like horses, but someone has actually bought it now, and I think it's going to be like a wedding venue. There's an elevator for horses in that place. I read a thing on it. Yeah, if you've gone to Dallas, you've passed it. It's right by all the baseball fields. Yeah, and it's just been falling apart my whole life.
The one at the park? There in Sanger?
Yeah, I think it's Sanger.
Yeah.
But
Right before you get
there's like all these baseball. If you're driving south, all these baseball fields, and it's just huge
Yeah.
mansion.
Yeah.
And like at one point, someone was trying to redo it, and then it just stopped, and then the rocks have all fallen down
Yeah,
again.
it caught on fire.
Yeah.
At one point.
Well, last I heard, someone bought it.
Yeah.
They had bought the land for sure, and they've been doing horse stuff. But
There was a few years ago someone bought it and then they sold it because they didn't want to do the renovations.
yeah.
So.
I mean, as long as we've been married, it's been.
So, anyways, what is the point of this?
I'm saying they didn't calculate the cost.
Oh, they didn't calculate the cost. Good one, Heidi.
There is a point to this.
I got distracted with the baseball fields and horse elevators. Yes, great. Someone
Did not calculate.
over 40 years ago did not sit down and calculate if they had enough to finish it. Good point. So what happens if the builder cannot finish? He will be ridiculed and mocked
In Bible studies.
in Bible studies. Where on the spectrum do you think this one falls? We've got allegory, design, embodiment.
It's embodiment because it embodies a truism.
There you go. I don't think anything in here is designed or is allegorical. I think it's just making a point. It's just a duh. Like if you're going to build something, doesn't it make sense to just stop for a second, sit down and calculate the cost and see, can I finish this or not? Because if you just jump into it, right, if you just dive in without considering if you can finish, then maybe you'll be like the guy in Sanger and be ridiculed because you didn't have what it takes to finish. Okay, so that's the first one. Now we have the strategist. Verse 31. Or, what king, when he sets out to meet another king in battle, will not first sit down and consider whether he's strong enough with 10,000 men to encounter the one coming against him with 20,000? Or else, while the other is still far away, he sends a delegation and asks for terms of peace. And then he says, so then none of you can be my disciple who does not give up all his possessions. So sell everything. More random Jesus. We'll talk about it. Okay. So now the king. What must the king do first? He'd sit down and consider. First one was to sit down and calculate. This one is to sit down and consider. And what is he considering? The first was the cost. This is he's considering his own strength. And when must the king do this? Before sets out. And I put that there because what is the crowd doing? The crowd is already going with Jesus. And so what Luke does is he connects the king in the parable with the crowd using the same word. So when it says that the crowds were going along with Jesus, it's the same word when it says the king sets out. So the crowd is going out just like the king is going out. But what must the king do first? He needs to sit and consider his strength. So by inference, what should the crowd be doing? They need to sit down and consider and calculate. Do I have what it takes to finish? Considering the cost or calculating the cost and considering their own strength. Do I have what it takes? And so Jesus stopping the crowd and giving them these parables is his way of getting them to understand where he is going and what it will cost them if they want to be disciples. Calculate the cost. Are you willing to lose your life? Because it could cost you your physical life. Figuratively, you're not doing it right as a disciple if it's not costing you something. Right? And I mean in terms of sin, selfishness, I don't know, whatever it is. If we're still who we were before we decided to be disciples, then we're not doing it right. It needs to cost us something. We need to say, what do you want? Your will, not my will. That is the prayer of Jesus, and that is the prayer of a disciple. Here's what I want, but ultimately it's what you want.
I got a comment. When something don't go right, you have to have faith.
Mm-hmm.
You know, in other words, everything you're asking for, you're not going to get. And when life hands you what life hands you, you have to have faith in Him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
He's still who He is.
Yeah. And for whatever reason, what He's handing you is somehow for your good. In the long run, maybe not right then.
My mom always said everything turns out for the best. And then not see it for a while, but that's where it'll be.
And maybe you don't see it on this side of heaven.
Yeah, that's true.
But yeah, for sure. And that's why I say, as disciples, we say, here's what I want, but knowing full well, it might not be what he wants. And so you have to have faith to say, if it doesn't turn out the way that I want, then I have to have faith that whatever is going on is for my good because you love me. And if you ever question his love, you just got to look to the cross. And that is the measure of God's love for you. I always say it's not your circumstances that is the measure of God's love, but that's how we like to measure God's love. We look at our circumstances. That's not the measure of his love. The measure of his love is the cross. It's cross over circumstances. Consider your strength. Are you strong enough to endure suffering? And then we have this random, so then none of you can be my disciples who does not give up all his possessions. What is that about?
Jesus being Jesus.
Jesus being Jesus. He does this again in another parable. He says something different, but he's got, the next one's about divorce, and that's in 2 weeks. He's like, why are you talking about divorce all of a sudden? So, I think I said it, not last time, because that was a video, you weren't here. The time before, I think I said, when you see something random, it's not random. There's a reason it's there. So this seems pretty random, but why do we think all of a sudden he's talking about possessions? I said there, the statement seems very random. Why does Jesus jump to talking about possessions? He's talking about discipleship.
Isn't that part of giving up your life?
Yes. Keep going.
Possessions are not always tangible.
Keep going.
Take it with you.
Yes. But what do people, how do people live though?
With possessions.
So, I think it was the video lesson. If you guys haven't watched the video lesson, in that he's talking about the guy who comes to Jesus and is like, hey, be a judge between me and my brother about this inheritance, right? And then in verse 15 of chapter 12, Jesus says that even in abundance of possession, life does not consist of possessions. So the thing is, for most people, their life consists of their possessions. They might say, no way. But if you look how they live and how they talk about their possessions, and they might not even know they're doing it. Remember the fires? I bet we all knew somebody who lost something there. Or even during a tornado, you see people interviewed on TV, and what do they say about their house? That had our whole lives in it. That house is gone. It had our whole lives. What they're doing is they're mistaking their possessions. They're alive. Their family's alive, but they're saying our whole lives were in there, because they're missing they're doing what Jesus is saying, that your life is not consisting in what you possess. But for some reason, for thousands and thousands of years as human beings, that's how we think in terms of what life is. How much do I have in the bank? What do I have? What kind of car do I have? What kind of house do I have? All this stuff. They got a boat. Well, they've got a lake house. Whatever it is. They got club tickets, and I'm down here, on the bleachers. Whatever. Anyway. So a lot of times as we... it got dark early tonight, people. We're in trouble in 2 weeks, right, with this.
Yep.
So does that make sense, though?
Yeah.
And when we see this, if you go back and look at chapter 12 again in Luke, you'll see that his whole teaching is about that our life is more than possessions, right? Our body is more than food and for clothing. All right, so Jesus is not teaching that we must give all our possessions to be disciples, right? Because then we're all in trouble. Because I don't think any of us are poor here. But what he's saying is that in order to be a disciple, he or she must be ready, if called upon, to give up his or her life. Possessions. Because when someone says, give up all your possessions, why does everybody freak out about this verse? Because everybody can't do it. Right? I mean, everybody. You go into a Baptist church, hey, Jesus said give up all your possessions. Well, no, what he's really saying there. Because it freaks everybody out. Because what if Jesus is serious? But Jesus is using this shock to point out our heart. Because when someone says, give up all your possessions, you don't have to tell me, but what do we instantly think and feel in our hearts? I'm not doing that. Because...
Wedding photos. I didn't take underwear.
Yes, Heidi is referring to when the fires were coming down our street. Not really in our street. It was on the end of our street. We could see it. I called her and said, hey, get your work laptop and, get my laptop and whatever else, because we're going to need to go at some point probably. And it's time to go. And I look in the back of the car, and we've got, like, wedding photos. I don't know. I mean, we brought the bunny, so that was good. But I'm like, where's our clothes? Where's, like, the fresh underwear, Heidi? Come on. We have 3 stinky kids, and none of them have clothes. They got their stuffies. But honestly, that is I don't know what that day was like for you, but now that I think about it, like, that really kind of shows you in that moment what does your life consist of. And I think of my little girls. They were freaking out. Where's Kitty and where's Puppy? Their stuffies. Because that was the most valuable thing to them. And we lost Puppy one time at a baseball game, and you would have thought Elliot's world had ended. In suffering class, we talked about different types of grief. And there's an ambiguous grief, and she definitely had that, and it was sad to watch. But anyways, okay, let's finish up. You can't, so then, let's see, let me finish, where are we at? All right, so it says, sell all your possessions, verse 33. Therefore, salt is good, but if even salt has become tasteless, what will it be seasoned? It says, it is useless either for the soil or for manure pile. It is to be thrown out. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. And so here's what I think is going on here with the salt. You can't season salt with salt to make it salty again. The salt is useless. If salt loses its saltiness, you just can't pour more salt on it and make it salty again. And in the same way, disciples who are not committed to following Jesus are useless as disciples. And so I'll break the logic down. I say Jesus uses the absurd to make his point. And he does this in other places too, if you look for it. He'll say something absurd to make oh yeah, duh point. So it's absurd that salt not be salty. Salt cannot become unsalty.
Okay. Because I was like, how can it become unsalty?
Exactly. That's Jesus' point. He's being absurd. He's like, so if you say, well, if salt becomes unsalty, it's like, that's not a thing,
Okay.
right?
Yeah.
But the point is, it can't become unsalty. It's not a part of who the salt or what the salt is. If it were to not be salty, it is not salt. It is useless. And so it's absurd that disciples would not follow Jesus. That's what a disciple is. Does that make sense? If you say, all right, I've sat down, I've calculated the cost, I've considered it, I've considered my own strength, and I'm doing this. I'm going to follow Jesus. And then all of a sudden you're like, nah, I'm good. Other things are going on in life or whatever that are way more important than Jesus. That love that should be disproportionate is slowly not disproportionate anymore. Jesus is saying, you're a useless disciple. And maybe you didn't fully consider the cost or your own strength to endure. So how should we live? We want to be worthy disciples of Jesus who have... let's see, I just typed this today. We want to be worthy disciples of Jesus. We have to... if we want to. I need to look at my own right. If we want to be worthy disciples of Jesus, we have to calculate the cost and consider our strength, knowing we are not strong enough and need to rely on God's strength. The first place to start in becoming worthy disciples is making Jesus the preeminent one over our life. And then I put the Bible verse, Philippians 3:7, where Paul writes, but whatever things were gained to me, those things I have counted as loss for the sake of Christ.